Welcome, Susan, to the Happier at Work podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to have you as my guest today. So we met initially through a mutual friend, Helen Joy, who's a previous guest on the podcast speaking about first-time managers. And she connected us and we had this wonderful conversation. So Susan is based in the UK and Helen is from the UK, also based in the UK. And she connected two Irish people. So that in and of itself, we thought was quite interesting. So Susan, would you like to tell people a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Aoife, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me this morning. Yes, so I'm a Dingle woman, firstly. And
Dingle.
But I started out my career working in accountancy. I trained with Deloitte in Dublin many years ago, the last century, in fact. And at the turn of the century, I headed for Australia, like many Irish people did at the time.
Myself included, yes.
There we go, and worked for 2 years in a large, like VHI equivalent or health insurance equivalent company there. Came back to Ireland and had learned a lot from the Aussies, I think, about work-life balance. Because they had really thought about, they finished work and left work behind. And they were very outdoor living and everything. And I think it started to put something in my head about there was more to life than work.
Yeah.
But having said that, I got a contract back in Ireland and then started to think, well, what else do I want to do? I want to go and live and see more of the world. And so I volunteered with GOAL, which is an Irish aid agency, international humanitarian agency, and found myself in Uganda as a financial controller with a small team, 2 offices, a small team and a small budget, 700,000. But within 2 years of being there, we'd grown to 4 million, over 100 staff and 6 offices. And that experience was incredible and kind of gave me this impetus that there was so much you could do in the world and got me noticed. So I got promoted by GOAL to be roving, and I traveled a lot of Africa with them, responded to emergencies like in Pakistan after the earthquake in 2005 and the tsunami earlier that year. But I got fed up of living out of a suitcase. Mm-hmm. And so I relocated back to Ireland, but got a job actually in the UK as a finance director for an international organization that cleared landmines and unexploded ordnance around the world, MAG, and a Nobel Peace Prize winning organization. So it was really cool to be part of something like that and amazing impact of what they did around the world. And it was a really tough job. So I went into quite a difficult environment where they had a lot of financial issues and the whole place basically had to be turned around. And that took a lot out of me. And I suppose I began to question where was my life going? And was I just only going to work? Because I was working phenomenal hours for a long time and it's not sustainable. So I actually took a year out, Aoife, and went back to university and studied nationalism and ethnic conflict, because I was really curious about identity. And maybe given a time again, I might study psychology or organizational development, but it was identity and what it means to, who we are and what we represent in the world took me to nationalism and ethnic conflict. And I learned a lot that you can take to the workplace, actually.
Yeah.
Because it was all about groups and how groups are formed and what keeps them together and culture from a different aspect. And then I actually, looked around for work in the area, but it is hard to transition without a proper plan. So I kind of resorted back to finance, applied for a job as a CFO in an organization in Switzerland, and I didn't get it. But it was probably the best thing that ever happened, because they came back to me and said, will you come and work with us on a contract basis for a couple of months?
Yeah.
And I did. And 6.5 years later, I left there after relocating to Switzerland and working with them. But I moved from being a finance consultant into program management, into operations, and to be the director of operations, overseeing a team of 10 country directors in Asia and Africa,
Wow.
which became very much a coaching role. So I was the kind of their representative in headquarters, but they were all very senior individuals who were really good at what they did. And they needed someone who would listen to them and who would challenge them and support and consult, but also challenge so that they grew. And I suppose that's then what took me, Aoife, in a different direction again, because my partner got a job here in Oxford and I relocated with him and decided, right, it's time to head out alone and start my own thing. And as a finance person, used to sometimes worry about not being seen beyond the numbers, and also saw the value of seeing beyond the numbers. And so I actually called my business Beyond the Numbers, because there's so much more than numbers in a business. And even if that's a payroll number, we all deserve to be seen as a human.
Yeah.
And it's very much about putting people first for me.
Yeah.
And of course, I started around the time the pandemic hit, which is a challenge in itself, but hey. And that kind of brought me, well, how do I get my platform open a bit? And that took me to starting my own podcast, which I've called Life Beyond the Numbers. And that can really be about anything, but what it's about for me and my listeners is, if you're curious about how to have a more fulfilling work life, then our guests and myself will share stories and insights that can help you.
Brilliant. No, I love that. And it's about the stories behind the numbers. I just really, really love that approach. In terms of today, what we're talking about is this idea of a toxic work environment. And before we started recording, we kind of touched on this idea, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, that a toxic work environment, is there a kind of a blanket that is just most definitely a toxic work environment versus something that's toxic for an individual? Because I mean, I love this concept of fit, because an individual doesn't fit in, and therefore that's toxic for an individual. So for example, if I am not a very competitive person, but I'm put into a sales team, and therefore that competitive nature of that team is not a really good fit or a match for me, that then becomes a toxic environment for me, because I don't feel like I fit in. I don't have that sense of belonging. So I'd love to get your thoughts on, is there this kind of blanket approach to toxicity where there's some organizations or teams that are just toxic, and what those traits are or what those characteristics are, versus something that might be toxic for an individual? I always like to think of these, that a company doesn't set out to be toxic, let's say. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
I don't think anyone sets out to be toxic, do we? And I suppose if we bring it to the emotional side of things, negative emotions, negative isn't always the right word, because sometimes some of them can be constructive anyway. But, anger or fear or competitiveness can be seen as negative even. Is that an emotion? Well, it's more of a trait maybe. They spread. Things are infectious. And so if you've got a happy workplace and everyone's really happy, that's spread as well. But we're more, unfortunately, as humans, we're more geared towards the negative side, which I find fascinating in itself, because I'm very positive, and not in a kind of a, kumbaya, woohoo, everything's more rosy in the garden. But I just have a positive mindset and rarely find things negative or get stuck in that mode. But you can easily find yourself in a negative environment. And what does that look like? Okay, so I walk into a meeting room and everybody's looking at their feet, and there's just an air in the room of, oh God, here we go again. And I don't want to be in this meeting, or this is a waste of time. And I always think it's the person at the top as well, Aoife, who sets the tone. And whether that's the management team or the team leader, that's where your negative environments come in. So if we take the tone at the top at the beginning, so if your leader is a bit of a bully, then that is going to spread throughout the organization, and it's going to have a knock-on toxic impact.
Yeah.
And some people will replicate that because it's what they see and it's what they think will endear them, I guess, to the line manager as well. And so that kind of thing, I think, spreads quite easily. And I've certainly seen that in situations where you'll have maybe a group of 5 senior leaders together. They'll all start to kind of replicate one another, and that will find its way down through the organization. And it's the people then down at grassroots level that are struggling under the weight of this toxic environment. And so you can have that, you can have it just spread like a disease through the organization. But on the other side, you can just have a team leader, perhaps one of those 5 is toxic.
Yeah.
And maybe in an environment where the 5 senior managers are together, they get on okay, and the goodness balances out the badness, for want of better terms. But maybe that person with his or her team is creating a toxic, negative environment. And usually how it shows up is people are afraid to say what's on their mind.
Yeah.
They're afraid to voice their opinion. They think their opinion doesn't count, that actually there's no point in saying anything because no one will listen. And even if they do listen, they won't understand. And it's those kind of subtle cues. And we think toxic has to be horrendous or, you know, something you would just never put up with. But actually, the term toxic can just be that it's not psychologically safe in that work environment. And I don't feel like going to work today because I don't trust my colleagues or they don't have my back. Now, if it's one team, it's easier to identify and do something about it. If it's the whole organization, then I suppose you need to cut off the head often to kind of turn things around, you know. But culture is, you know yourself, Aoife, culture and fit, they're very intangible.
Yeah.
And it's making that what might be invisible and intangible, making it tangible and visible.
Yeah.
Like writing down where this is impacting me or recording, how does this make me feel? That's when you start to see that this is not good for me, or I'm not being myself at work, or my workplace is constricting me as opposed to bringing me alive or letting me shine.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's loads to dive into there, Susan. This concept of psychological safety, I think it's crucially important. It is what builds trust in an organization. Do I feel safe? And you're so right in saying, like, oftentimes we might perceive a toxic environment as being something that's very obviously bad. But if you're in an environment that is not psychologically safe, you might not realize it, that you just don't feel safe in sharing your opinion. You just don't feel like you want to go into work. You don't feel like you can trust your colleagues to do the right thing. But you'll still kind of put up with it, and you'll still go into work every day. You'll still show up and kind of get involved, but you just won't maybe share your best ideas. You won't challenge the existing thinking. So I really, really love that idea. What I will say about this concept of culture and fit, while it is and can be very intangible, I suppose with my data background, I come at it from the perspective that it is a measurable thing, and that you can ascertain what the values are in an organization, and you can ascertain whether or not those values are being lived within the organization. So whether it's, you know, these are the values that we talk about and that we espouse in the organization, but are people actually, do people buy into those? And you can measure whether or not that's actually happening. How are decisions being made in an organization? How do people behave, especially at the top? and it does go back to what you were saying. The culture of an organization comes from the leadership 100%. And whether that's an individual leader with kind of a strong personality, whether that's a positive or a negative thing, or a collection of leaders, exactly like you said. So really, really interesting. And I love this concept of psychological safety. So maybe we start there and talk about how to build more psychologically safe environment.
Yeah. The funny thing is, I suppose, is if let's take the home environment first, because
Yeah.
at home, hopefully you have a psychologically safe environment.
Mm.
You can talk to the people that you live with, or maybe it's even friends if you live alone, that you have a group of people who you feel safe opening up to. You trust them, that they're not going to use that against you or tell everybody or whatever it might be. But also, and they support you, but also they might challenge you to change the way you think about something, or to look at different things, or to grow. So, if you think about parents and kids, I guess that's what parents hopefully are doing, is giving their kids this psychologically safe environment, and teachers as well in a school. And you're supporting, you're consulting with them, and you're challenging them as well. So in a way, hopefully many of us, before we ever get to the workplace, have encountered psychologically safe environments. And what happens when we get into work? We stop trusting one another for some reason. We stop being open. And I suppose that if I think back when I joined the workforce, whatever, 1996 now, so 25 years ago, you were two different people, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe not intentionally, but you would never open up about, well, I feel a bit crap today, or actually, I don't really understand what you're talking about, or whatever. It was very hierarchical, I suppose. And in a way, the hierarchy, the command and control type environment, is not conducive often to psychological safety. The psychological safety is like, break those boundaries, barriers, silos down a bit, and let's talk to each other on a human level. Let's be open with one another. And this is not about being soft or being kind of touchy-feely. This is about creating a constructive environment where people can speak to one another openly and honestly, say what's really going on, what they agree or disagree with, without being combative about it. But there's nothing wrong with disagreement, and there's nothing wrong with open, what's the word? Conflict's not the word, but constructive conflict.
Yeah, like positive conflict.
Yeah, having a proper bloody debate about something.
Yeah.
But not feeling that you can't say what's on your mind. So having the environment that supports allowing you to say what's on your mind, but then supporting others when they disagree with you, to let them bring that out, and kind of getting together in a way that challenges each other to grow.
Yeah.
Now, I've been in plenty of meetings where we say we're going to be innovative today. Let's be innovative. We really need to. It's one of our values.
Let's turn on our innovative thinking hats.
And then somebody says, well, I think we should do this. And everybody goes, yeah, let's do that. Because it was the boss and nobody wanted to say that was a crap idea.
Yeah.
Or it was the most loudest person in the room who drowns everyone out. And that is not a psychologically safe environment. And you'll never innovate. If people are sitting in a room going, well, there's no point in me saying what I think is really going to make a difference here, because no one's going to listen, they're going to drown me out, they're only interested in listening to so-and-so over there.
Yeah.
Then you can't that's not psychologically safe, and it's not conducive to innovation.
Yeah. And I suppose there's a couple of different elements to dive into there, Susan. And it's this: if you're in a psychologically unsafe environment, like, do you broach the subject? Do you have that conversation? Versus if you are in a psychologically safe environment and you are able to have that difficult conversation, how do you actually go about doing it then? So a couple of different elements there to maybe ponder.
So firstly, I suppose, how do you know you're not in it? And I think that's the thing that many of us take for granted, that work is just like this.
Yeah.
And you know, I think it's when you hear yourself perhaps thinking, my voice isn't valued, I'm afraid to speak up, or I won't offer my opinion, or you bite your tongue, you hold your tongue. That's when you start to realize it's not safe here.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes there's a difference between being afraid to speak up because actually, you need the confidence to do that. This is a bit different.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is more about actually no one's going to listen, and it's I'm going to be shot down.
Yeah.
The messenger is going to get shot. So I think it's firstly identifying that the environment is psychologically unsafe. Now, who do you go to about that? Well, if the whole organization is like that, there must be people that you get on with that aren't.
Yeah.
And, I think teams in organization, you'll often have informal teams who work together. So perhaps you have an informal team and you have a psychologically safe environment. I think if you maybe talk about it and dissect and support one another, that will help you to think about, okay, how can we positively influence others to move towards this way of working?
Yeah.
And I suppose I think, Aoife, it's about sacrificing yourself sometimes.
The sacrificial lamb.
The lamb, and hopefully not the lamb to slaughter. But if you feel self-confident and you have enough self-belief that this isn't the right environment, you can start by being open and vulnerable and trusting others and showing that trust, supporting people, encouraging people. You can be the lone voice that starts to shift an organization to change. And you will get joined by others. I think that's one thing. Sometimes it's the ripple effect, isn't it? Now, again, it'll depend on how widespread the negative or the toxic environment is. If it's just a team and your team leader is the person who's constraining everybody, then I guess it is talking to either their boss or somebody on their management team or your HR people. Yeah. And actually, you talk about data, and you're absolutely right. What I meant about intangible is it's often a feeling.
Yeah,
but the
absolutely.
only way that you're going to be able to express that is turning it into data. And the data needs to be recorded. So it's like, even after a meeting, reflect on what happened in that meeting and make notes. And I suppose this is what I'm a spreadsheet person, I'm going to be with a numbers background. But I would often keep notes in a spreadsheet under certain headings, headings, because they were headaches, under certain headings about, well, I encountered this today in this meeting. And then you start to see a theme, and it's more than you. Sometimes you feel like it's only me.
Yeah.
And I think when you can look back and notice a pattern or a theme, then you have evidence or data. And it's so much easier to go and sit in front of somebody and produce examples. Yeah. Because then, we talked about difficult conversation, Aoife, then the conversation isn't difficult. Yeah. For me, what's difficult about a difficult conversation often is it's difficult for you. You feel, oh my God, how am I going to have this conversation? So what you want to do is you want to dissolve that difficulty, and data is the way to do that. Because if you sit in a room and you just say, oh, this is crap and I can't handle it, and oh, Jesus, your man is a pain in the ass, or whatever it might be, you're not really going to influence others' opinion. You might just make yourself look bad. Yeah. Whereas if you can go down and you can sit in a room and you can say, Aoife, yesterday I was in a meeting with my team, and our discussion was around psychological safety, for want of a better topic. And what I noticed was nobody in the room said anything unless the team leader it was in agreement with him, and no one said anything differently. And then what I noticed was I wouldn't say anything differently. And even though I didn't agree with what he was saying, I didn't feel I could voice my opinion. And then whoever you're talking to hopefully can dive in a little bit more, maybe do some discreet inquiries. And oftentimes these things have a way of writing themselves. Not themselves, they're not going to write themselves, but once you involve others and there's a spotlight on it, other things come to light.
Yeah.
And you can tackle them, but no one can tackle things if they're silent.
I love this approach of using data to kind of, what you mentioned was dissolve the difficulty out of a difficult conversation. But I suppose I'd love to dive in a bit more detail and I'll put my hand up and say that I am this kind of person that I do tend to shy away from having those difficult conversations. So I suppose I'd love to get your thoughts on how to get started. Like how do you maybe it's finding the courage to have those difficult conversations that you have to have at work.
So yeah, I mean, I suppose the way I think about it is people are just people. So all of us we're just human beings. And if we treat each other as human beings and think that actually Aoife sitting across from me has the same, she gets up in the morning, she goes, brushes her teeth, goes to the loo, whatever. Yeah. We kind of do the same things. And if I open up in a human to human, person to person type relationship, that Aoife will engage in conversation with me too. Now, it's also accepting the feelings that are going on inside your body. Right? Because I do a lot of, I'm in Toastmasters, right? And I love public speaking. If you don't know what Toastmasters is, it's public speaking. And I really enjoy it. Now, before a speech, and this is before any conversation that you're maybe thinking about, is what I will feel is probably butterflies in my stomach. And there'll be a bit of an adrenaline rush. And some people talk about dry mouth and others talk about all sorts of different feelings.
Sweaty palms and yeah.
Exactly. And for me, that's a sign that my body is getting ready to perform. And I frame it as excitement rather than nerves. And I think I have to feel like this so that I can gear myself up to perform. And I suppose that's what we're doing every time we're having a conversation. There's an element of performance in it. And so I think it's making friends, for want of a better way of describing it, with those feelings, and actually saying, well, what am I really afraid of here? What's difficult about this for me? And break it down. Now, that's all well and good, because you still have to have the conversation. But if we take something like a difficult conversation being the first time I had to fire someone, Aoife, and I was in Africa, and I had to fire a guard at the office, and he'd stolen from us, basically, so it was absolutely warranted that this guy needed to go. But he also was probably feeding his family, and maybe there were other families dependent on him as well. And, his earnings were very low. And for me, I was so worried about that conversation. I really didn't want to have it. I would have done anything not to have it, but it was my job. And my boss said to me, Susan, if you didn't feel like this, you wouldn't be human.
Yeah.
And that was a great kind of leveler. And so what I did was I started thinking about me. I thought about the person across from me.
Yeah.
And how I could best break bad news, I suppose. And not necessarily how I would want it to be broken to me, because that's not what it's about either. It's who is this person in front of me, and how can I be as compassionate and kind towards them, even if this conversation starts to get difficult.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when we worry about what the other person's going to think or how they're going to react or what they're going to do, but we've no control over that. So really think about yourself and how you can best show up, and then go with the conversation. And if it does start to get a bit angsty or whatever, stop. Allow silence in a conversation. We're afraid of silence. We don't like quiet. We think we have to fill that void. And actually, silence is usually really helpful. The other thing about a difficult conversation is, especially if you're firing someone, or having maybe performance reviews, when people get bad news or something they take as personal, that it's critical or whatever, even if it's not intended that way, they're not going to hear anything else you say.
Yeah.
So stop and let them process and ask questions. And I think that's something I learned over the years as well. It's not about you showing you know it all, or you showing a brave face, or you being extra strong. It's about you showing up for the person who's sitting across from you.
Yeah.
And actually, you're doing them a disservice by avoiding them, and yourself too, I think, because when you avoid something, you give it a lot of headspace. And it tends to grow in your head.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It tends to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And actually, what I find is the more you sit down and talk with people and are open, and also come from a help me understand, because maybe you don't have it right too. But you don't have to know everything about what you're talking about. You don't have to have all the answers. You just need to be a human being in a room.
Yeah.
And respond to the other human being. Yes, prepare yourself, prepare your thoughts. It's never going to go as you planned. And I have had people blow up in front of me, like, get really aggressive and assertive. And I've had people who've thanked me for being open with them and whatever. And I think it is about you learning to feel comfortable.
Yeah.
It's like anything, Aoife, the more you do it, the better you get. And
yeah.
in fact, the last person that I had to let go in a job I was in, she gave me her personal phone number, her personal email address, and a hug as she was leaving the office. And that, for me, I'm not trying to sing my own praises here or anything, but I had become, competent at having uncomfortable conversations in a way that put the other person first.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really, really nice approach, and that people probably often neglect. They're worried more about how they come across, whether they know what they're talking about, whether they'll be able to answer all the questions that come up in the conversation. So a really, really nice approach to put the other person first. So that first experience you spoke about, was that was your first experience of having a truly difficult conversation, that you didn't have any other option but to actually have the conversation, as opposed to shying away from that? Because exactly as you said, Susan, that was your job. And did you find then that once you had that conversation, it became easier over time as you had to have more of those conversations?
It never does, Aoife.
Oh, okay. That was not what I was expecting.
And I don't mean it like that. I think it's always, those conversations always try you, and they should, in a way, because that it's like that adrenaline I talked about earlier. You're going into some sort of a performance, and I don't mean you're going to be fake. I mean that you have to prepare to give that your all.
Yeah.
And like you would a job interview or anything else, all of these are kind of difficult conversations. And if they become easy, then you become blasé about it.
Okay. Yeah.
So that's what I mean, I suppose. Yes, it certainly becomes easier because I became more aware of maybe what was going on inside of me, and more calm outwardly. I was able to master that outward calmness, even if there was a bit of inner turmoil.
Yeah.
Because there's still, when you're holding space for somebody and they're clearly and visibly upset or angry, there's all sorts of like stuff firing in you going, get out of here, danger, danger, danger.
Yeah.
So I think I got much better at remaining calm.
Yeah.
And actually I got much better at being silent.
Okay.
And that's where I noticed that things really took off, was if I shut up and just not sat back, but actually really held, you know, somebody's look or showed that I was ready to talk about to them, that they processed. And I think that's what it's about. It's like you need time to process. Anytime you get a shock or bad news, you know, and I often ended up answering the same question over and over and over again. But I never once
someone
said,
processes it, is it?
Yeah, exactly. But I never once said, we've been over this, or, you know, I never looked at my watch. And I think that's it. You have to be there for that other person.
Yeah.
Put your own needs away and be there. And when you're thinking about someone else, you're not thinking about yourself, and you're showing up better.
Yeah.
And
so
they
basically,
notice.
Yeah. So I suppose going back to this thing about whether or not it gets easier, it's you can kind of maybe master the skills better, but don't get complacent about it because you're still showing up in a very full way for another human being. And you need to be there to hold that space for them, to be comfortable in the silence and all of those great things.
And I think you have to feel that kind of that adrenaline rush as well, Aoife. You have to feel that this is important.
Yeah.
And, you know, you don't have to make the conversation difficult for you or difficult for them, but they're still difficult.
Yeah.
You know, it's not a conversation either party would choose to have, probably.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you wanted to share in relation to this idea of psychological safety and being able to hold those difficult conversations?
So I suppose the thing about psychological safety is when you have that, you have an amazing work environment and work team. And I really like the book 9 Lies About Work. I don't know if you've read that book.
No, haven't. No.
It's an excellent book. It's written by Marcus Buckingham and I can't remember the other guy now, but they one is Cisco and one is Strengths Finder, whatever. And
yeah,
they use
I know the Strengths Finder book, all right, from Marcus Buckingham. Yeah,
they use a load of data from studies around the world, and they bring in 9 lies about work. And one of the things they say about work is that work is really about the team you're in.
Yeah.
You know, that you can survive a lot if your team is good. So even if the whole workplace is crap in general, if you're in a really great team, you'll put up with everything. And I think there's something to be said about that. I think if you're in a team that you will do anything for your team members, you know, that you'll show up for them and you kind of push each other to do better. And you will innovate and you'll be creative and you'll support one another, and you'll also play on each other's strengths, because you'll realize, well, you know, Aoife's way better at podcasting than Susan is, so let's get her having that part and I'll do the numbers or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's psychological safety definitely is possible. It's a I wouldn't say a right, but I think it kind of is, because I think that's dignity at work.
Yeah.
I do think that, you know, to be able to bring yourself to work and feel safe is something we should all be entitled to do.
Definitely.
And look for it, find it and create it.
Yeah.
You know, force it if you can.
And I suppose that would be an interesting avenue to go down, Susan, is this idea of, if I am a leader and I've realized the importance of psychological safety, and I realize that actually I haven't created a psychologically safe environment, what are the steps that I need to take in order to change things around?
Yeah. So I suppose the first thing you have to do is admit that out loud to others.
Okay.
And I think that shows leadership. You know, there's this sense that leadership is you have to know the answer and you're on top and blah, blah, blah. But actually, for me, leadership is about admitting you don't know.
Yeah.
And just
You don't
saying,
have all the answers.
and kind of
Yeah.
sitting down with your team and going, do you know what? I've realized that we used to work really well together in certain respect. And, we did X really, really well. And of late, the energy is low.
Yeah.
I feel like maybe you're not talking to me as much, but I've noticed that I'm dominating. Really come and tackle an issue with me. So again, it's back to the sacrificial lamb.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's about being vulnerable yourself,
Yeah.
putting yourself out there, and maybe asking people to recall when was the kind of last time that as a team we worked together well. What do they think? And that's not for you to respond to, it's your data collection exercise. And Amy Edmondson is the founder, or the person who talks about psychological safety. And you can Google, there's like 7 questions to ask to establish whether or not there's a psychologically safe environment where you are. And you can use those questions even with your team. That, it's like, do you feel safe speaking up? Now, you might want to give them that to do as a questionnaire, but I really think it starts with you as the leader. You have to be open to the feedback. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it all. And it doesn't mean it's all right, but you have to be open to it. And you have to show people that it's safe to give it. And once people see that it's safe and you didn't come back at them, or no one laughed at them, or whatever it might be, everyone else will start to open up. And that's where the magic happens.
Yeah.
Isn't it? When people actually, and every voice matters. Every voice counts.
And going back to what you said earlier, Susan, as well, this idea of innovation, like, oh, this morning we're going to be really innovative. Like, you can't just turn that stuff on. But if you create an environment that's psychologically safe and where people are free to share their ideas, no matter how far out there, then that's where, exactly to your point, that's where the magic happens. That's where that idea might be a bit too far, but actually that gave rise to someone else having another idea where they're taken on from experience of an area that they have, or things like that. So yeah, really like that. Really like that approach.
There's kind of a nice analogy, Aoife, with nature as well. So if you think of a well-tended garden, how does your garden grow? And it's well tended, and the weeds are cleared, and it's watered, and it blossoms. And on the other side of the road, you have the garden that, it's growing wild, and everything's all over the place, and there are briars and brambles. But is it a garden? Is it doing what you wanted it to do? Is it blossoming? And the other garden, I don't know, it's, everybody loves it and wants to spend time with it.
Yeah. And it ties in with this idea of setting clear expectations, setting clear guidelines, and having clear boundaries as to, what we do and what we don't do here. Really,
I think boundaries are very underestimated.
Yeah.
And again, boundaries are often the invisible. And I think it's about making your boundaries visible and tangible by agreeing how we're going to work together.
Yeah.
And, the rules of the game need to be understood by everyone. They cannot just be implied. Because how I understand you is going to be different to how you understand me. And I suppose that's it, isn't it, Aoife? We're all so different. We're all unique. We're all carrying our own, every bit of culture we've got to be at this point in time.
Yeah.
And we have to learn how to collaborate, which requires some compromise, but you'll only get there if you tell people when they're crossing your boundary.
Yeah. And this is the point I suppose I was going to make. So you raise an interesting observation there about, we all come with our own baggage, if you like, from previous work experiences. And this is what has actually gone on for me. Therefore, my interpretation of what's going on is going to be somewhat blurred or skewed by my past experiences at work. And in our interactions, and especially from a manager perspective, from a leader perspective, they need to be very much aware that others may have that type of baggage and they may have those types of issues going on. And exactly that, tying into this psychologically safe environment, that if someone, first of all, knowing what your boundaries are, and even if you've never heard the term before, it's about understanding when something doesn't feel right to you. If you feel like someone has done you wrong in some way, oftentimes we don't speak up about that, and we don't feel safe to have that conversation. But when you start saying, actually, that's not okay, whether that might be, and this is just an example that has come to the top of my head, but if someone shows up 5 minutes late to a meeting, for example, and you say that's really, it's not okay, you don't say it in front of everyone, but you just explain clearly, like that it sends a message, and you need to show up on time to meetings. And if you can't, then they need to, and I suppose I'm thinking more from an office perspective, back when I worked in an office. But if you're going from meeting to meeting and you have to change rooms, but the meetings start and end on the hour, as opposed to giving a bit of leeway, 5 or 10 minutes in between meetings, to have a bit of breathing space and to get to your next meeting. But really understanding, like, if someone crosses that boundary, then having that conversation and feeling safe to have that conversation.
And I suppose not making assumptions, because you don't know. I mean, anything could have happened for that person to be late. But I suppose the boundaries I often think about, if you might get an email at 10 o'clock at night,
Oh,
and
yeah.
on your phone, and it pings, and you just get this sense of, oh, that's
Would
a
they ever
boundary
leave me
being
alone?
that's a boundary being crossed.
Yeah.
But you're the one that doesn't have to answer that or look
Yes.
at it. And
Yeah.
you have to make that boundary, but then you tell people,
Yes.
you might send me an email after hours, I'm not going to look at it until the morning.
Yeah.
And I think the clearer you are with people, that
Yeah.
instead of letting people run with their imagination of, I
Yeah.
can be, have you accessible anytime, the clearer you are, the better you get on. So, like, for me, I would go on a 2-week holiday and I would tell everyone, I'm not going to be around for 2 weeks. I'm not going to look at emails, blah, blah, blah. And it always worked. Whereas so many people would check their emails while they're on.
And this is it. I think if you say what a boundary is, and you say, I'm going on holidays, I won't be checking my emails, and then you do, then your boundaries are kind of permeable, and no one can really listen to what it is that you say, what you set as a clear boundary. And the next time you go on holidays, you better believe that you're going to be getting emails that are directed specifically at you. But this whole email thing, well, first of all, I mean, this email culture, it frustrates me quite a lot, that everything has to go via email. Just because my inbox is constantly overflowing with various different types of messages and newsletters and things like that. But on email specifically, my thoughts are that just explaining to someone in a footer of an email, I only see emails, or I only send emails between 9 and 5, or alternatively, given that we're in this kind of flexible remote working environment at the moment, I send emails at a time that suits me, and I don't expect an immediate response. I do expect a response from you at a time that suits you, so that I don't expect people to be reading emails out of hours. I don't expect people to be answering phone calls out of hours. And if they do, then, and I've crossed a boundary, then they should let me know.
Exactly. And it's like going to your local bakery or local shop. I mean, they're not going to open the door for you at 7 o'clock in the evening just because you want something.
Yeah.
They've closed their boundary for the day.
Yeah.
And it's kind of that simple. And it's like, what works for me, what works for the organization, and there must be a way that both of those match.
Yeah.
And I think, you have to stand up for yourself. Everyone will push boundaries. We start doing that as soon as we're born. We're always looking for more, the next thing, whatever. So you have to set your own boundaries, and it's much easier to do it from the beginning. It's so much harder to reclaim something later on, like you said about the, going on holidays and If you did it once, then people will expect you to do it again. And it's setting those expectations very, very clear. And none of this is rocket science.
Yeah.
None of it's particularly difficult, but it's difficult for us.
Yeah.
And it's about making a decision that if I'm going to show up at work in my best state, then what do I need to do to be there? And that, I think, is about having boundaries often. And it's easy to say, oh, just one more email before I finish up, or I'll just do this one more thing.
Just this one more thing. Yeah.
And then
absolutely.
75 hours later, you're still, and no one gives a crap because they've all gone home.
Yeah. This is it. Susan, we've covered quite a lot of ground there, from toxic work environments, creating a psychological safe environment, and boundaries. So we've packed quite a lot into this episode. The question I ask everyone, what makes you happier at work?
So if I always go back to my values, I think, for this one, because for me, honesty. So I'm, what you see is what you get. And that's what I like back.
Yeah.
Sense of humor.
Yes. Having fun.
Yeah, having fun at work. Work doesn't need, who said work needs to be serious? It doesn't.
Yeah.
And that creative playfulness really helps. And learning. I love learning and growing. So if I can do all of those at work, then that makes me happier at work. So I think I talk about finding joy at work, and you talk about happy at work, I'm joy. And what brings you joy, do more of that. And go for your 80-20 rule if you can. 80%, this is fabulous. 20%, okay, I've got to do it.
Yeah. This is it. And if people want to reach out and find out more about you and what you do, what's the best way that they can connect?
Oh, so many places now, Aoife, No, I think LinkedIn is a good start. I'm fairly active on LinkedIn. And then I have a website, beyond-the-numbers.com. And a podcast, Life Beyond the Numbers. And other than that, I mean, I'm on Instagram and Twitter as well, but that's my fun part of my work, probably. But LinkedIn and the podcast are probably the two best places.
Great. And we'll put a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes anyway, for anyone who wants to connect. Similar to myself, a complicated Irish name. Irish surname in your case, Irish first name in my case, that often, if you're not from Ireland, you don't know how to spell it. So we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Thank you so much, Susan, for your time today, for sharing your wisdom and your insights. I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to chatting to you again in the future.
Yes, thank you, Aoife. It was great.